The dust of Oakhaven clung to Eleanor Vance's worn boots, each gritty step announcing her presence in the small, sun-baked town. She felt the familiar weight of eyes on her, a silent judgment that had followed her for years like a shadow. Her height set her apart, a long-limbed figure among shorter, more settled folk, and her independent stride seemed to draw whispers before they even formed words. The air tasted of dry earth and pine resin, a stark change from the damp city streets she had left behind. A horse whinnied somewhere down the single main street, its sound sharp against the quiet hum of distant industry, perhaps the blacksmith's forge. Eleanor kept her gaze steady, fixed on the general store ahead, its weathered wood planks leaning slightly. She tried to make her face unreadable, a shield against the curious stares that pricked at her skin. Each glance was a fresh reminder of why she was here, chasing a thin promise on a brittle piece of paper. Inside the general store, the air was cooler, thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and something vaguely medicinal. Bells above the door jingled a faint, forlorn tune as she stepped across the threshold. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a loud complaint in the hushed space. Behind the counter, a woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun looked up, her kind, crinkled face breaking into a polite, if wary, smile. This was Martha O'Malley, the town matriarch, Eleanor surmised. She had heard her name mentioned on the stagecoach ride in. "Morning, stranger," Martha said, her voice warm, though her eyes held a careful assessment. "What can I get for you?" Eleanor reached into her coat pocket, her fingers finding the folded newsprint. The paper was soft at the edges, worn from countless readings and refoldings. It had been her constant companion, a desperate hope clutched close through long, lonely nights. She smoothed it carefully on the worn wooden counter, pushing it across to Martha. "I'm here about this," Eleanor said, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor that still lived beneath her ribs. Martha adjusted her spectacles, peering at the smudged type. Her brow furrowed slightly as she read the simple advertisement. Capable hands sought for remote mountain homestead. Shelter and honest work offered. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Martha finally looked up, her gaze sharper now. "Silas Blackwood, is it?" Martha asked, her tone flat. "You're a bit far from his usual type, dear." Eleanor felt a familiar wave of defensiveness rise. "The advertisement made no mention of type," she said, her voice a fraction cooler than before. "Only a capable hand." She was a capable hand. Her hands, though slender, carried the faint, ingrained calluses of years spent working, doing what needed to be done. They were not soft hands, nor were they idle. Martha sighed, a soft sound of resignation. "Silas is a solitary man," she explained, her voice softening, a hint of pity in her eyes. "Lives up the old mine trail, a good day's trek from here. Keeps to himself, always has. Don't much care for company, let alone newcomers." She paused, her gaze lingering on Eleanor's tall frame. "Especially not a woman." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had expected this, of course. Every new place brought the same unspoken questions, the same skepticism. Her height, her quiet strength, her lack of a husband or family to account for her existence. These things made her an anomaly, a challenge to the established order. She yearned for a place where her presence did not require explanation, where she could simply be. "The ad is still current," Eleanor pressed, ignoring the implied warning. She had traveled too far, spent too much of her meager savings to turn back now. This was her last chance, a desperate gamble for a life free from constant judgment. Martha nodded slowly. "As far as I know, but the trail, it's not for the faint of heart. Rough going, even for a seasoned climber. And Silas, he's a hard man, practical to a fault, expects a good day's work for his keep." She picked up a small, smooth stone from the counter, turning it over and over in her fingers. "Some folks say he's a bit touched, living up there all alone." Eleanor thought of the countless times she had been dismissed, underestimated, judged based on appearances. She thought of the whispers that followed her, the doors that closed. This remote mountain man, described as pragmatic and solitary, seemed like her only option. a place where perhaps her differences would blend into the vast, indifferent wilderness. "I'm not faint of heart," Eleanor replied, her eyes meeting Martha's squarely, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." Martha studied her for a long moment, a new expression in her eyes, perhaps a flicker of respect, or simply a deeper understanding of Eleanor's desperation. "Well then, I suppose you'll need supplies," she said, her voice practical now. She pointed to a shelf laden with sacks of flour, tins of beans, and dried meat, and some good sturdy boots for that trail, if you don't already have them. Eleanor bought what she could afford, a small sack of provisions that felt pitifully inadequate for what lay ahead. As she paid, Martha offered one last piece of advice. "The old mine trail starts just past the old mill, by the creek. Don't stray from it. And mind the weather, it turns quick up there." With a nod, Eleanor gathered her meager belongings, the newspaper ad carefully tucked back into her pocket. Stepping out of the general store, the sun was higher, beating down on the dusty street. The judgmental glances were still there, but now they seemed to carry a hint of morbid curiosity, wondering if this tall, determined woman would make it back down the mountain. She paid them no mind. Her gaze was already fixed on the distant peaks, jagged teeth biting into the clear blue sky. The old mine trail was less a path and more a suggestion, a faint scar on the mountain's rugged face. It began with a gentle incline, winding through scattered pines, the ground still relatively soft underfoot. But soon the ascent grew steeper, the air thinning with each upward step. Eleanor's breath hitched, a burning in her lungs that spoke of effort in the unaccustomed altitude. She pushed forward, her long legs accustomed to movement, finding a rhythm despite the growing strain. The silence of the mountain was profound, broken only by the crunch of her boots on loose scree, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, and the distant call of a hawk circling high above. The scent of pine was stronger here, sharper, mingled with the damp earth and the sweet, unexpected perfume of unseen wildflowers clinging to rocky outcrops. Her heart hammered a steady beat against her ribs, a drum solo of determination. Hours blurred into a grueling march. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows of the ancient trees. Eleanor's muscles ached, a deep, persistent throb in her calves and thighs. Her shoulders protested the weight of her pack, though it held little more than provisions and a change of clothes. Sweat trickled down her temples, stinging her eyes, but she refused to stop, refused to rest for more than a few sips of water. Every loose rock that shifted under her foot, every gnarled root that threatened to trip her, became a small test. Each obstacle met with a grim resolve. She thought of the faces in Oak Haven, their veiled doubts, and a fierce, stubborn pride propelled her onward. She would not fail. She could not. This mountain, this remote homestead, was her last refuge. It had to be. The trail grew narrower, more treacherous. In places it was barely discernible, a faint trace etched into the steep slopes. Dense thickets of scrub pine clawed at her clothes, pulling at her braids. The air grew colder, a sharp bite that hinted at the approaching evening. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow ache, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the next step, then the next. She thought of the newspaper ad again, its vague promise, a capable hand. She was capable. She had always been capable. Her past was a tangle of responsibilities she had carried, burdens she had shouldered alone. This mountain, with its raw, unforgiving beauty, felt like a mirror to her own existence. It demanded strength, resilience, and an unwavering will to survive. As twilight began to deepen, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Eleanor caught a scent on the wind, wood smoke. It was faint at first, a whisper carried on the cool mountain air, then stronger, a comforting, earthy aroma. Hope, a fragile thing, bloomed in her chest, pushing aside the bone-deep weariness. She was close. Minutes later, she rounded a bend in the trail, her vision blurring slightly from exhaustion. There it was, Blackwood's cabin. It was a sturdy, single-room log cabin, nestled precariously on a mountain slope, almost swallowed by the dense canopy of ancient pines. Its rough-hewn walls and smoke-stained chimney spoke of endurance against harsh winters. A faint wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life, of warmth. The setting sun cast the cabin in shadow, but a soft glow emanated from a window, a single beacon in the encroaching darkness. Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. She had made it. But now the true test began. She approached the cabin slowly, her footsteps muted by the soft pine needles on the ground. The silence was profound once more, save for the distant cry of an owl and the rustle of leaves. She stood before the rough-hewn door, her hand hovering, about to knock. Before her knuckles could connect with the wood, the door creaked open. Silas Blackwood emerged, a compact, rugged figure silhouetted against the dim light inside. He was shorter than Eleanor, but radiated an undeniable physical strength, his shoulders broad, his posture unyielding. A grizzled beard framed a face etched by sun and wind, making him seem older than his likely years. His eyes, keen and piercing like a hawk's, were set deep, missing nothing. They swept over Eleanor's tall frame, starting from her worn boots, traveling up her long legs, over her travel-stained coat, and finally settling on her face. His gaze was unsettling, devoid of welcome, yet intensely observant. Eleanor felt herself straighten, meeting his eyes with her own, stormy gray against his piercing blue. The silence stretched, heavy and taut, filled with unspoken questions and immediate judgments. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, but she held her stance, refusing to appear weak. Finally, Silas's gruff voice broke the stillness, cutting through the thin mountain air like a blade. "You're not what I expected." A single sentence, spoken without malice, yet weighted with the crushing force of every past judgment, struck Eleanor Vance like a physical blow. The words, "You're not what I expected," echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence between them, vibrating through her bones. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat, a sharp, ragged sound that no one else heard. All the long miles, the aching muscles, the desperate hope that had propelled her up the unforgiving mountain path now seemed to crumble into dust. Her vision blurred at the edges, the rugged outline of Silas Blackwood's cabin wavering before her eyes. A familiar heat pricked behind her eyelids, a stinging sensation she knew well. It was the prelude to tears, a weakness she absolutely refused to grant him. She locked her jaw, forcing her lips into a thin, unyielding line. Her hands, calloused and strong from years of labor, clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She would not break here, not now, not for this man. The cold mountain air seemed to intensify around her, a stark mirror to the sudden chill in her heart. A lifetime of dismissive glances, of whispered remarks about her unusual height, of being an outsider in every town she had ever called home, coalesced into this single potent moment of rejection. The memory of the gossiping women in Oak Haven, their eyes following her every movement, came flooding back. She had left all that behind, chasing the faint promise of a newspaper advertisement, a chance at a new beginning where her stature might be an asset, not a curse. But here, even in this isolated wilderness, the old patterns held fast. Her mind raced, a furious, chaotic storm within her skull. Not what he expected. What did he expect? A ghost, a figment of his own solitary imagination? Had he not seen the advertisement, the plain words promising only a capable hand? She had thought that meant strength, endurance, a willingness to work, all things she possessed in abundance. Yet one look at her, and he had dismissed it all. The unfairness of it all tasted bitter on her tongue, metallic and sharp. She felt the urge to turn, to flee back down the treacherous path, to escape the piercing blue gaze that held her captive. Every instinct screamed at her to preserve the last tattered remnants of her pride. But where would she go? Back to the town, where every face held a familiar mixture of curiosity and disdain. Back to the rootless existence that had driven her to this harsh, remote place. No, the thought was worse than facing Silas Blackwood's scorn. Her feet, rooted to the damp earth, refused to move. She stood rigid, a tall, unyielding figure against the deepening twilight, the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth filling her nostrils. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met his without flinching, a silent challenge in their depths. Her chest ached, not just from the climb, but from the raw, exposed wound of her disappointment. She had built this new life in her mind, brick by painstaking brick, and now, with two curt words, he had threatened to demolish it all. Silas Blackwood, compact and rugged, stood before her, his posture unyielding as the ancient pines surrounding them. He watched her, his keen eyes missing nothing of her rigid stance, the barely perceptible tremor in her jawline. He saw the fire beneath the stoic facade, the defiance that simmered in her gaze. He did not understand the intricate tapestry of rejection and resilience woven into her spirit, but he recognized the raw, untamed strength in her stillness. He had expected a man, perhaps a burly, weathered individual with broad shoulders and a short temper. Instead, he had found a woman, tall and striking, certainly, but a woman nonetheless. The advertisement had been intentionally vague, a test of sorts, meant to deter the faint of heart. He had not anticipated this. He cleared his throat, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the quiet mountain air. The air was growing colder, the last vestiges of daylight fading rapidly over the distant peaks. A thin, wispy cloud of his breath hung in the air before him. "It's getting dark," he said, his voice gruff, devoid of any warmth. His gaze flickered past her, towards the winding, barely visible path that led back down the mountain. "Trail's dangerous after sundown. Wolves come down from the ridges." His words were not an invitation, not a welcome, but a simple, unadorned statement of fact, a pragmatic assessment of the immediate situation. He was not concerned with her feelings, only with the practicality of her presence. Eleanor recognized the subtle shift in his tone, the way his eyes seemed to calculate, assessing her not as a person, but as a problem that required a temporary solution. The thought was humiliating, yet a tiny, desperate part of her clung to it. He turned slightly, his hand making a curt, almost imperceptible gesture towards the side of the cabin. A lean-to, rough-hewn and rudimentary, clung to the cabin's western wall. It was little more than a slanted roof supported by sturdy logs, open on one side to the elements, though a heavy canvas tarp was partially drawn, offering some meager protection. The scent of damp wood and something wild, perhaps dried leaves or forgotten tools, wafted from its shadowy depths. "You can stay there tonight," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves were a burden. "It's dry mostly. There's some blankets." He did not look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the cabin door, as though eager to retreat inside and leave her to her own devices. The offer was grudging, steeped in reluctance, a duty rather than an act of hospitality. It stung, yet it was an offer nonetheless, a reprieve from the cold, dark mountain night. Eleanor remained silent, her pride battling with the raw, undeniable need for shelter. Her legs ached, her stomach rumbled with a hunger she had ignored for hours, and the biting cold was beginning to seep into her bones. The prospect of spending the night exposed on the open mountainside, listening to the unseen sounds of the wilderness, was a stark deterrent to her defiant retreat. She swallowed hard, the metallic taste of resentment still clinging to her tongue. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of wood smoke from the cabin's chimney offering a faint, almost mocking warmth. Her gaze swept over the lean-to. It was not much, certainly no home, but it was a barrier against the night, a temporary truce with the unforgiving environment. She would accept it, but only as a means to an end. This was not surrender. This was strategy. She would survive this night, and then she would face him again, on her own terms. Without a word, she moved towards the lean-to, her tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. Her boots crunched on the loose gravel, and dried pine needles beneath her feet. The cabin door creaked open, then shut with a soft thud, a clear signal of Silas Blackwood's retreat. She was alone again, facing the vast, indifferent wilderness, but this time with a makeshift roof over her head. The space was as uninviting as promised. The ground was hard-packed earth, smelling faintly of damp soil. A stack of coarse wool blankets lay folded in a corner, emitting a faint, musty odor. A few pieces of firewood were haphazardly piled against the back wall. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough wood of the lean-to support beams, feeling the cold, splintery surface. The canvas tarp, pulled mostly closed, let in only a sliver of the fading light. She dropped her worn travel bag with a soft thud, the sound swallowed by the quiet of the mountain. Her muscles protested with a dull ache as she knelt, then stretched out on the rough blankets. They were thin, but they offered a small measure of warmth against the increasing chill. The wind, a mournful whisper through the pine trees, began to pick up, rustling the leaves and stirring the dry branches. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant, unseen wilderness. Lying there, huddled in the rudimentary shelter, Eleanor felt a wave of profound defeat wash over her. The hope that had been her constant companion on the journey had been cruelly dashed. She was an outcast again, even here, in a place she had believed would offer a fresh start. The darkness deepened around her, pressing in from all sides, mirroring the heavy gloom in her heart. She closed her eyes, the familiar sting of tears once again pricking at them. Yet, even in the depths of her despair, a tiny, persistent flicker ignited within her. It was a stubborn ember, banked by years of facing adversity, by a pride that refused to be completely extinguished. She was here now on this mountain, and she would not be so easily driven away. The words, "not what I expected," replayed in her mind, and with them, a fierce, silent vow. She would show him. She would prove him wrong. She would not turn back. The sharp chill of the mountain morning bit at Eleanor's exposed skin. She stirred, her muscles protesting the unyielding planks of the lean-to. A thin layer of frost coated the rough wood above her head, a stark reminder of the night's bite and her temporary, unwelcoming shelter. Defeat had tasted bitter the evening before, a heavy cloak draped over her hope. But as the first sliver of dawn painted the distant peaks in hues of bruised purple and pale gold, a familiar, stubborn fire began to rekindle within her. She would not be broken so easily. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth, a raw, untamed scent that filled her lungs and braced her spirit. Her long limbs ached with an unfamiliar stiffness, a consequence of the hard ground and the gnawing anxiety that had kept true sleep at bay. She pushed herself up, wincing slightly, then smoothed down her practical braids. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the immediate surroundings. The cabin was silent, a blocky shadow against the brightening sky, its chimney a sentinel against the coming day. She heard no movement from within, but she knew. He was there. He was always there, a silent, judging presence. Eleanor walked towards the main cabin, her boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. A thin curl of smoke now drifted from the chimney, a sign of life, of routine. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow ache that echoed the emptiness in her spirit. She found a stack of unsplit logs near the woodpile, thick, gnarled pieces of oak and fir that looked impossibly dense. An axe lay nearby, its head gleaming dully in the nascent light. This would be her beginning. This would be her proving ground. She picked up the axe. Its weight was substantial, heavier than she was accustomed to, the handle rough against her palms. She positioned a log, feeling the chill of the wood even through her worn gloves. Taking a deep breath, she swung. The blade met the wood with a dull thud, bouncing off rather than biting deep. A jarring tremor ran up her arms. She gritted her teeth. The wood seemed to mock her, its sturdy resistance a mirror of the man inside the cabin. Again she swung, putting more force into it, more frustration. The axe lodged itself, but barely, wedging itself into the tough grain. She pulled, twisted, grunted, but it remained stubbornly fixed. Her breath hitched. A prickle of humiliation flushed her cheeks. She imagined Silas watching from a window, a faint, sardonic smirk on his face. The thought fueled her, twisting her frustration into a fierce resolve. She wouldn't be defeated by a piece of wood. Not now. Not here. She tried a different angle, a different log. The crisp air stung her lungs as she worked, her movements stiff and awkward at first. Her hands, though slender, were used to labor, but this was different. This was brute force, a specific kind of technique she hadn't mastered. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, mingling with the chill. Each failed attempt chipped away at the fragile confidence she had begun to rebuild. Was she truly so inept? The whispers of old judgments, the dismissive glances from Oakhaven, they all clawed at the edges of her mind. "You're not what I expected." Silas's words from the previous night echoed, a cold, sharp blade. After what felt like an eternity, a log finally gave way with a satisfying crack. The two halves tumbled to the ground, revealing the pale, fragrant interior. A small, ragged gasp escaped her lips, a mix of relief and pure exhaustion. Her shoulders burned, her arms throbbed, but a tiny seed of triumph bloomed in her chest. She had done it. She picked up another log, her movements a little more deliberate, a little less desperate. The rhythm began to assert itself, slow and uneven, but present. Mid-morning, the cabin door creaked open. Eleanor didn't look up, but her senses sharpened. The faint scent of wood smoke grew stronger, a sign of his proximity. She felt the weight of his gaze, a physical pressure on her back. Silas Blackwood emerged, carrying a bucket towards the spring, his compact frame moving with an economy of motion that spoke of years in this wilderness. He did not offer a greeting. He did not offer a word of instruction or encouragement. He simply moved, his eyes sweeping over her efforts, lingering for a fraction of a second on the scattered, uneven pile of split wood. His expression was unreadable, as always. A grizzled beard obscured most of his jawline, but his eyes, keen and piercing like a hawk's, seemed to miss nothing. Was it skepticism she saw there? A grudging curiosity? She couldn't tell. He simply passed, disappearing down the narrow, rocky path towards the water source. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she forced herself to keep going. She had to prove her worth. Her survival depended on it. Later, Silas directed her with a curt gesture towards a section of fence that had fallen into disrepair. The posts were rotted at the base, the wires sagging and broken in places. This was a different challenge. Eleanor approached it with a flicker of apprehension. She had never mended a fence before, but her mind was quick, observant. She examined the broken posts, the way the wire had been twisted, the sturdy remaining sections. She found some old tools in a shed nearby, a hammer, some nails, a coil of new wire. The scent of aged wood and dust filled the small space. She began by steadying a loose post, using a piece of rock to shore it up. Her fingers, though slender, moved with a surprising dexterity, untwisting the old, rusty wire. This task felt less about brute strength and more about precision, about problem solving. She found a strange, almost comforting rhythm in the work, her mind focused on the immediate problem at hand. She measured the new wire, cut it with a pair of well-worn pliers, then began to weave it through the existing fence, tautening it with strong pulls. The sun warmed her back, and the faint hum of insects filled the quiet air. This was different from splitting wood. This felt natural, almost intuitive. She discovered a surprising ease, a satisfaction in bringing order to disarray. Her hands, though calloused, moved with a grace born of deep concentration. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. This she could do. This she felt competent at. Silas returned from another chore carrying a bundle of dried herbs, his movements silent as a shadow. He stopped a short distance away, his eyes fixed on her work. Eleanor felt his gaze again, but this time it was different. Less like a brand, more like a weight. She continued to work, refusing to acknowledge his presence directly, but acutely aware of every subtle shift in his stance, every measured breath he took. He watched her mend the fence, his head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he observed the neat, sturdy repair she was making. There was no judgment in his posture now, only an intense, almost analytical observation. A blend of skepticism still lingered in the set of his jaw, but she sensed something else too. A flicker of grudging curiosity, perhaps, a moment of reluctant acknowledgement. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared, his face returning to its usual stoic mask. But Eleanor had felt it, a tiny shift in the air between them, a slight easing of the suffocating tension. A small, quiet hope began to stir within her. Maybe she wasn't entirely dismissed. The day wore on, a relentless cycle of tasks. She hauled water from the spring, the heavy buckets making her shoulders burn. She gathered kindling, her hands scratched by thorns and rough bark. She swept out the lean-to, stirring up clouds of dust. Every task was performed under the invisible, yet ever-present shadow of Silas Blackwood's observation. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her every move analyzed, judged, weighed. Her internal monologue was a fierce battle against self-doubt. "Keep going, Eleanor," she told herself, her voice a whisper in her mind. "Don't let him see you falter. Don't let him win." The memory of the town, the whispers, the dismissive looks, they all spurred her on. This was her last chance, this desolate mountain, this stern man. They were all she had left. She pushed through the fatigue, through the aching muscles, through the gnawing fear of failure. Her pride, wounded but not broken, refused to yield. As evening approached, a golden light spilled over the mountain, softening the harsh edges of the cabin and the surrounding wilderness. The air grew colder, signaling the approach of another frigid night. Eleanor was tasked with preparing the evening meal. It was a simple affair: dried beans rehydrated over the fire, and strips of salted meat. The aroma, though plain, was comforting in its warmth. She knelt by the small fire pit outside the cabin, stirring the beans with a wooden spoon, the flames licking at the bottom of the pot. Her hands, now sore and blistered in places, moved automatically. Her mind, though weary, still churned with the day's silent conflict. Had she done enough? Was her effort visible? Tangible? Had she made even a slight impression on the stoic man who had deemed her not what he expected? The questions circled like hungry vultures, refusing to be silenced. She desperately craved a word, a nod, anything to indicate she had met some unspoken standard. Silas was inside the cabin, the heavy wooden door left ajar. She could hear his movements, the scrape of a chair, the soft rustle of something being moved. Her ears strained, hoping for some sound that would give her a clue, some indication of his thoughts. The wind sighed through the pines, a mournful sound that seemed to carry her own unspoken anxieties. Then through the open door, clear and distinct, came a low mumble. It was Silas's voice, gruff and laconic, speaking not to her, but to himself. The words were few, but they landed like stones in the quiet evening air, piercing her fragile peace. Still not enough. Eleanor froze, the wooden spoon suspended over the bubbling pot. The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. Not enough. After all her effort, all her struggle, all her aching muscles and bruised pride, it was still not enough. A wave of despair washed over her, cold and absolute. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. The injustice of it, the sheer crushing weight of his judgment, threatened to overwhelm her. But then, as quickly as the despair had come, a different emotion surged through her, a hard, cold anger, a fierce, unyielding defiance. Her fingers tightened around the spoon, her knuckles turning white. The fire, which had felt comforting moments before, now seemed to burn with her own indignation. Not enough? He thought she wasn't enough? She would show him. She would push harder. She would break herself before she broke. The stubborn ember of resolve, which had flickered throughout the day, now roared into an inferno. She would prove him wrong. She would prove it to herself. The crisp mountain air, usually a balm, carried a new unsettling scent that morning. Damp earth, freshly disturbed, mingled with the familiar pine and wood smoke. Eleanor stepped out of the lean-to, her gaze immediately drawn to the cabin's usual water source, a narrow runnel fed by a distant spring. Yesterday it had flowed freely, a silvery ribbon winding over smooth stones. Today, a jagged scar of fresh rock marred the scene. A sudden rockslide, a common enough occurrence in these untamed mountains, had partially blocked the crucial vein of water. Larger stones, dislodged from higher ground, had tumbled down, creating a formidable barrier. The flow was reduced to a trickle, barely enough to fill a bucket in an hour. This was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat to their daily survival, a constant reminder of the land's unforgiving nature. Silas Blackwood was already there, his compact frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He knelt, not touching the stones, but his keen eyes assessed the damage with an almost surgical precision. Eleanor watched him, a familiar tension tightening her jaw. His presence was always a challenge, a silent judgment that pricked at her every move. She felt the weight of his expectations, or rather his lack of expectations for her, pressing down. He turned a small rock with his boot, his brow furrowed in concentration, the grim set of his mouth a clear indication of the problem's severity. Eleanor approached cautiously, her boots crunching on loose gravel. She didn't speak. She knew better than to offer unsolicited advice. Besides, what could she say? She understood the language of labor, of necessity, but not the specific dialect of mountain engineering. She stood a few paces back, her hands clasped, listening to the reduced gurgle of the water, a whisper where there should have been a song. The quiet hum of the wilderness was subtly altered, a note of discord introduced. Silas rose, running a hand through his grizzled beard. He scanned the surrounding slope, then returned his gaze to the cluster of rocks, particularly a large, irregular boulder that sat squarely in the path of the water. Its size was intimidating, easily twice the volume of a man's torso. He walked around it, pushing with his shoulder, grunting softly. The stone remained stubbornly in place. He then tried to pry it with a fallen branch, but the wood snapped with a sharp crack. Eleanor watched, her mind already calculating. She saw the lines of force, the potential leverage points. Her body, despite the constant aches from unfamiliar tasks, felt a surge of readiness. She had spent a lifetime proving she was more than her frame suggested, more than the hushed whispers of Oakhaven implied. Her height had always been a curse, setting her apart, making her an easy target for ridicule. But it also came with a certain strength, a reach, a perspective few others possessed. She knew she was strong, not just in spirit, but in muscle. Silas straightened, sighing. He picked up a heavier branch, still surveying the scene. He was strategizing, Eleanor realized, mentally assembling a plan. He would probably try to find a longer, sturdier lever, or perhaps he would simply start chipping away at the smaller stones around the boulder, a laborious, time-consuming process. He would assume it would be a two-person job, at the very least, or a long, solitary battle for himself. He wouldn't even consider her as a significant asset for this particular task. She was useful for mending fences, for cooking, for the smaller chores, but not for brute force against the mountain. The thought stung, a familiar, dull ache in her chest. She had heard his muttered words yesterday. Still not enough. He saw her working, he saw her effort, yet it still wasn't enough to change his mind, to truly register her capabilities. A quiet fire ignited within her, a stubborn resolve. She would not ask permission. She would not wait to be asked. She would simply do, without a word, without a request. Eleanor stepped forward. The crunch of gravel under her boots was the only sound breaking the morning quiet. Silas glanced up, his eyes briefly meeting hers, a question in their depths. She offered no explanation, just a determined set to her mouth. She walked directly to the massive boulder, bypassing the smaller stones, ignoring the tools Silas had briefly considered. She crouched, her long limbs bending with a surprising agility. Her fingers, calloused but still slender, found purchase on the rough, cold surface of the stone. She felt the texture, the mossy patches, the sharp edges. Her breath hitched slightly as she inhaled deeply, bracing herself. She ignored the prickle of doubt that whispered she might fail, that she might only confirm his low opinion of her. This was not about proving him wrong, not entirely. It was about proving to herself that she still had the capacity to surprise, to overcome. Her muscles tensed, a slow, deliberate gathering of power. She shifted her weight, finding her center, a technique learned from years of hauling heavy loads in her former life. The stone was immense, unyielding, rooted deep in the disturbed earth. She pushed with her legs, engaged her core, and pulled with her arms, a guttural grunt escaping her lips. The effort was tremendous, a burning sensation spreading through her shoulders and back. Her vision narrowed, focused entirely on the resistant mass before her. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her boots, the slight give of the earth around the boulder. Then with a creaking, groaning sound, the boulder moved. Not just a tremor, but a solid, undeniable shift. A wave of raw, exhilarating triumph shot through Eleanor. She leaned into the movement, using her entire body, a primal scream of effort trapped in her throat. The stone scraped against the ground, slowly, agonizingly slowly, but it was moving. Inches became a foot, then two. She was breathing heavily now, her chest heaving, the blood pounding in her ears. The damp earth smell intensified, mixed with the metallic tang of her own exertion. Silas had frozen. His movements, which had been purposeful and fluid moments before, were now completely halted. He stood utterly still, the heavy branch he had been holding now forgotten, resting against his leg. His gaze, usually so unreadable, was wide, fixed on Eleanor in the impossibly large stone. The morning light caught the slight parting of his lips, a flicker of genuine surprise momentarily cracking his stoic facade. His hawk-like eyes, which seemed to miss nothing, were now registering something entirely unexpected, something that directly contradicted every assumption he had held about her. Eleanor, still panting, finally wrestled the boulder out of the water's path. It rolled a few feet to the side, coming to rest with a dull thud. The water, no longer impeded, surged forward, a joyful gurgle replacing the previous trickle. The sound was like a cheer, a small victory in the vast, indifferent wilderness. She stood upright, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her limbs trembling from the strain, but her spirits soaring. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but a deep sense of satisfaction settled within her. She glanced at Silas. He quickly masked his surprise, his expression tightening, his eyes narrowing once more. The brief moment of unguarded astonishment was gone, replaced by his usual gruff impassivity. But Eleanor had seen it. She had seen the crack, however fleeting, in his carefully constructed shield. The awareness of it settled in her, a quiet, profound validation. She walked past him, heading back towards the lean-to to retrieve a shovel. She had cleared the main obstruction, but smaller stones and debris still needed to be removed to fully restore the flow. The air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Her body ached, but the fatigue was mingled with a fierce pride. She didn't need his praise, didn't need his acknowledgement. The water flowing freely was her reward. As Eleanor returned to her other tasks, picking up the shovel to clear the remaining debris, Silas gave her a sharp, unreadable look. It wasn't dismissive, nor was it openly admiring. It was a gaze filled with a complex blend of calculation and something akin to a reluctant recalculation. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes following her movements as she worked with renewed purpose. He then turned back to his own tasks, the heavy branch still resting on the ground, leaving Eleanor to wonder what, if anything, that moment had truly changed between them. The raw scent of pine resin filled Eleanor's nostrils as Silas gestured towards a stack of felled timber. The logs lay like fallen giants, thick and unyielding, their dark bark still clinging to the wood. He wanted them moved, he stated simply, to the far side of the clearing. His voice, a low rumble, offered no explanation, no instruction beyond the destination. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, a mix of apprehension and a defiant spark. She understood the unspoken challenge in his quiet command. Each log seemed heavier than the last, a stubborn weight that settled deep into her muscles. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the rough, damp bark, her fingers finding purchase in the grooves. The wood scraped against the earth as she dragged the first one, a sound that grated on her ears, a protest from both the timber and her own weary body. Sweat beaded on her forehead, trickling down her temple and stinging her eye. She paused, wiping it away with the back of a calloused hand, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The air, crisp and thin, burned in her lungs with every exertion. She wondered if he watched her, hidden amongst the shadows of the tall, ancient pines. She could feel his presence, a silent pressure, a constant assessment. Her pride, that stubborn, unyielding core of her being, refused to let her falter. Every ache, every tremor in her arms was a reminder of the countless times she had been dismissed, underestimated, simply for being taller, different. This mountain, this man, would not add to that long list. The next day, Silas pointed towards the overgrown path leading down to the creek, a tangle of thorns and low-hanging branches that had become almost impassable. He handed her a well-worn machete, its blade dulled by years of use, but still sharp enough to demand respect. The morning air was cool, carrying the damp smell of moss and decaying leaves. Eleanor gripped the handle, its smooth wood worn to a sheen, and began to cut. The rhythmic thwack of the blade echoed through the quiet forest, a steady cadence against the rustling leaves. Thorns snagged at her clothes, tearing at the fabric, leaving angry red marks on her skin. She ignored the sting, focused instead on the relentless push of the undergrowth, the stubborn resistance of nature reclaiming its own. Her arms began to ache, a deep, persistent throb from her shoulders to her wrists. The muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored them, just as she had ignored the whispers and pointed fingers in Oak Haven. She felt the sap from the broken branches stick to her hands, a bitter, earthy scent mingling with her own rising sweat. The path seemed endless, each cleared section only revealing more tangled wilderness ahead. Doubt, a creeping shadow, tried to worm its way into her thoughts. How much longer? Can I truly keep this up? But then the image of Silas's stoic, unreadable face flashed in her mind, and a surge of determination pushed the doubt away. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not give herself the shame of surrender. A sudden, biting cold front swept through the mountains in the afternoon. The sky, once a brilliant blue, turned a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken threats. Eleanor was in the middle of clearing another section of path, far from the warmth of the cabin, when the wind began to howl. It tore through the trees, a mournful sound that spoke of winter's coming grip. The temperature plummeted, and she felt the insidious chill seep into her bones, making her joints stiffen. Her breath plumed in white clouds before her, visible proof of the sudden cold. Her fingers, despite their calluses, grew numb around the machete handle. She shivered, a deep tremor that shook her entire frame. But she kept moving, forcing herself to maintain the rhythm. To stop was to invite the cold to fully claim her. Her teeth chattered, a relentless clatter that she tried to suppress. The mountain, it seemed, had yet another way to test her. Silas had said nothing about the approaching cold, only a curt instruction about finishing the path by nightfall. The unspoken expectation hung heavy in the frigid air. Eleanor pushed harder, the blood circulating through her veins, a meager comfort against the biting wind. The scent of pine needles, now sharp with frost, filled her nose. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the flickering warmth of a fire, then opened them, forcing her gaze back to the stubborn undergrowth. She refused to yield. Days bled into one another, marked only by the escalating demands Silas placed upon her own. He never spoke of her strength, never offered a word of praise, but his tasks grew, each one designed to push her further. She hauled more timber, splitting it into manageable logs, the heavy axe biting deep into the wood with the satisfying thunk. Her hands developed new calluses, rough and thick, a testament to her unending labor. She helped him clear fallen rocks from a treacherous gully, her shoulders straining under the weight of boulders that seemed too large for any one person. The effort left her breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The taste of dust and exertion was a constant companion in her mouth. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the earth, the precarious balance of loose scree, anticipating where a misstep could lead to disaster. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body a symphony of aches and pains. Her legs felt like lead, her back ached with a dull, persistent throb, and her hands often trembled from the sheer exhaustion. Yet a strange, grim satisfaction began to settle within her. Each task completed, no matter how arduous, was a small victory. It was a silent retort to all those who had ever called her weak, too tall, too much. Silas watched her, always from a distance, his keen eyes missing nothing. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of mountain stoicism. Eleanor caught glimpses of him, sometimes through the trees, sometimes from the cabin window, his silhouette dark against the vast, indifferent landscape. She wondered what he saw, what he truly thought. Was it still not enough? The question gnawed at her, fueling her resolve to push even harder. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of digging a new trench for drainage, her muscles screamed in protest as she peeled off her stiff, sweat-soaked clothes. She saw the bruises blooming on her arms and legs, dark reminders of her battle with the unforgiving earth. Her fingers, though strong, felt clumsy and raw. She dipped them into the basin of cold water, feeling the sharp sting as the cool liquid touched the broken skin. She had arrived in Oakhaven, seeking refuge, a new beginning, a chance to escape the judgmental eyes that had followed her whole life. This mountain life was a brutal one, demanding every ounce of her strength, testing her resolve in ways she had never imagined. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when a desperate longing for an easier life, for a moment of softness, would pierce through her stoic facade. A memory of a kind word, a gentle touch from long ago, would surface only to be ruthlessly pushed aside. She knew she could not give in to such weakness. To do so would be to crumble, to prove every one of her detractors right. The mountain demanded strength, and Silas demanded strength. She would give it to them, even if it meant tearing herself apart in the process. There was a fierce, almost savage beauty in the struggle, a raw connection to the land that spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed. The air grew sharper with each passing night, carrying the scent of frost and the distant cry of an owl. Her rough bed, a pile of furs in the lean-to, offered little comfort, but exhaustion claimed her quickly each evening. Her sleep was deep, dreamless, a temporary reprieve from the constant demands on her body. But even in her sleep, she could feel the phantom aches in her shoulders, the persistent throb in her lower back. She had to prove her worth, not just to Silas, but to herself. She had to show that her height, once a source of humiliation, was now an asset, a tool for survival. Every lifted stone, every cleared branch, every bead of sweat was a step towards reclaiming her own narrative. She was not just the tall, outcast woman. She was Eleanor Vance, capable, resilient, and unyielding. The final task of that week, or so it felt, came on a day when the sun, for once, offered little warmth. Silas pointed to a distant spring, a good half-mile up a winding, rocky incline. "Water," he grunted, his gaze directed at the twin buckets near the cabin. "It's running low." The implication was clear. Fill them. Eleanor picked up the heavy buckets, their metal handles cold against her palms. The path was steep, treacherous, and strewn with loose stones that shifted underfoot. Each step was a deliberate effort, her legs burning with the exertion. The slosh of water in the full buckets was a heavy, rhythmic sound on the return journey, a counterpoint to her own labored breathing. Her shoulders ached, the metal handles digging into her skin, leaving angry red welts. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the valley as she finally rejoined the cabin. Her chest heaved, her lungs screaming for air, and her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. She set the buckets down with a muffled thud, the water rippling gently within them. Silas was nowhere to be seen. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over her, an undeniable tide that pulled at her very core. She stumbled towards the lean-to, her vision blurring at the edges, and collapsed onto her rough bed. The furs offered little softness against her bruised and aching body, but she no longer cared. Every muscle screamed in protest. Every joint throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. She lay there staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling of the lean-to, the familiar scent of pine and smoke filling her senses. A single, unbidden tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a warm path down her temple. Had she made a mistake? Was this mountain, this life, truly worth the incessant struggle, the endless pain? The thought flickered, cold and sharp, through her weary mind. But then, a stubborn ember deep within her, a fierce, unyielding pride flared to life. No, she would not yield. Not now, not ever. A chill wind carrying the harsh scent of distant snow had begun to whip around the cabin. Dark, bruised clouds, heavy with promise, rolled swiftly down the mountain peaks, swallowing the last slivers of weak daylight. Inside, Eleanor felt the shift in the air, a certain tension before a true winter storm. Every creak of the old timbers, every sudden gust of wind rattling the single pane of glass, spoke of the coming cold, a profound, biting cold that demanded preparation. Silas, his movements more urgent than usual, wrestled with a particularly stubborn log outside the lean-to. His grunts of effort were sharp against the rising wind. Eleanor watched him for a moment from the cabin doorway, a faint tremor running through her own weary muscles. Her body ached from days of relentless labor, each task a silent contest against the mountain and its master. She felt the heavy pull of exhaustion in her bones, a constant companion that whispered tempting thoughts of surrender. Yet that stubborn ember of pride, fed by a desperate will to survive, still flickered. Silas suddenly straightened, pushing a hand through his grizzled beard. He eyed the lean-to, then the cabin, a knot forming between his brows. He needed to move the large, iron-bound trunk. It was a formidable thing, darkwood scarred and nicked from years of transport, its heavy metal straps glinting dully in the fading light. This trunk, Silas knew, held precious supplies, things that could not be left to the mercy of the impending blizzard. It was too massive for him to carry easily alone, but he was accustomed to tackling such burdens by himself. He had always been alone. He bent to it, his hands gripping the rough edges of the trunk. His muscles corded in his neck and shoulders as he tried to lift it, his face red with the strain. A low, frustrated groan escaped him. The trunk barely shifted, scraping a mere inch across the uneven ground. Eleanor watched, a strange mix of pity and grim recognition stirring within her. She knew that feeling. The frustration of a task that defied even your greatest effort. The world had often presented her with such immovable obstacles. Another grunt, louder this time, and Silas braced himself, trying a different angle. He put his full, compact strength into it, his boots digging into the soil. The trunk remained stubbornly rooted. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound lost in the wind's rising howl. He straightened again, his breathing heavy, his gaze sweeping the lean-to as if searching for a forgotten lever, a hidden trick. His eyes landed on Eleanor, standing silently in the doorway. He offered no look of request, no hint of expectation. His eyes simply acknowledged her presence, then returned to the trunk, a fresh wave of determination hardening his features. Eleanor felt a jolt. He wasn't asking for help. He was simply resigned to doing it himself eventually, no matter the effort. The thought rankled her. For weeks she had endured his silent judgment, his dismissive glares, his unspoken belief that she was somehow less capable. She had pushed herself beyond what she thought possible, striving to meet his impossible standards, to prove her worth in a world that had always underestimated her. Now, standing here, watching him struggle with something so undeniably heavy, she felt a sudden, fierce surge of something akin to indignation. Her legs, though weary, still held strength. Her arms, though tired, still possessed resilience. She had carried burdens far heavier than mere logs or water buckets. She had carried the weight of her past, the burden of societal judgment, the crushing loneliness of being different. This trunk, however dense, was a tangible thing. It was a challenge she could meet, a physical manifestation of all the unspoken doubts that had hung between them. Without a word, Eleanor stepped out from the doorway, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cold wind bit at her exposed skin, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the trunk, calculating its weight, its balance, its stubborn resistance. She walked deliberately towards it, her long limbs moving with a purpose that felt almost primal. Silas, still catching his breath, glanced up, a flicker of mild surprise in his eyes. He probably expected her to offer some useless advice, or simply walk away. She reached the trunk and stopped beside him. The raw wood of the cabin, the scent of pine and impending storm, filled her senses. Silas looked at her, his expression still unreadable, a question in his keen eyes. She did not meet his gaze. Instead, she knelt beside the trunk, her fingers testing its cold, rough surface. She felt the heavy, unyielding iron bands. It was indeed a beast. Her heart began to pound a little faster, a drumming rhythm against her ribs. Could she truly do this? Her body cried out for rest, for warmth, for an end to the endless strain. But her spirit, that fierce, unyielding part of her, roared back in defiance. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the sharp, cold air. She felt the familiar ache in her lower back, a constant reminder of the physical demands of this life. She positioned herself carefully, her long arms wrapping around the width of the trunk. She adjusted her grip, finding the points of leverage, the places where she could best distribute the immense weight. Silas watched her, a silent observer, his earlier frustration momentarily forgotten. He saw the grim determination etched on her face, the set of her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed in concentration. With another deep breath, a grunt of effort that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being, Eleanor heaved. Her muscles screamed in protest, a fiery complaint that spread from her core to her fingertips. For a terrifying second, the trunk refused to budge, mocking her with its inertia. Doubt, cold and sharp, tried to pierce her resolve, but she pushed it back, shoving it down with a force born of desperation. She wasn't just lifting a trunk, she was lifting the weight of every dismissive glance, every whispered slight, every moment of her life where she had been deemed insufficient. Then, with a sudden, agonizing lurch, the trunk lifted. It was off the ground, a monstrous weight suspended in her arms. She swayed, her knees threatening to buckle, but she fought it, gritting her teeth. The cold metal of the bands bit into her hands. The rough wood scraped against her clothes. She felt a burning sensation spread across her shoulder blades, a searing pain that threatened to overwhelm her. But she held on. She had to. Slowly, deliberately, she maneuvered the massive object. With a final agonizing heave, she shifted it onto her right shoulder. The trunk settled there, an enormous, unyielding mass, pressing down on her collarbone, forcing the air from her lungs. She gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, her vision momentarily blurring with the sheer effort. Her heart hammered wildly, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She felt the cold sweat prickling on her forehead despite the frigid air. Silas stood utterly motionless, his mouth slightly agape, his keen eyes wide with unadulterated shock. He had expected many things from her, complaints, perhaps a weak attempt, or simply a refusal to engage. He had not, in his wildest estimations, expected this. He saw the tremble in her legs, the white knuckles of her hands, the visible strain contorting in her face. But he also saw something else, a raw, ferocious strength, an unyielding will that defied every prejudice he had ever held. Eleanor, her breath coming in short, harsh gasps, took her first step towards the cabin. Each movement was a battle, each step an act of pure, unadulterated will. The trunk felt impossibly heavy, its weight pressing her down, testing the very limits of her endurance. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The cabin, only a few yards away, seemed to stretch into an impossible distance. She could taste the metallic tang of effort in her mouth. She could hear nothing but the rush of blood in her ears, the frantic beating of her own heart. One step, then another. Her body screamed in protest, every fiber of her being demanding that she drop the burden. But she pushed through the pain, through the dizzying exhaustion. She remembered the look on Silas's face when he had first seen her, the dismissive pronouncement that had cut her so deeply. This was for every time she had been told she was not enough, for every time her spirit had been underestimated. This was for herself. She reached the cabin doorway, her shoulders scraping against the frame. She navigated the narrow opening, the trunk a massive, awkward extension of her body. Silas remained frozen, his eyes tracking her every agonizing movement. The air crackled with a silent, profound tension. The scent of pine and wood smoke, usually comforting, now seemed merely a backdrop to her struggle. Finally, she was inside the single room. The warmth of the banked fire was a welcome, if fleeting, sensation. She scanned the floor, looking for a clear spot. Her muscles quivered, on the verge of collapse. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she lowered the trunk from her shoulder, guiding it carefully to the floor. It landed with a resounding thud that echoed through the small space, vibrating through the rough-hewn floorboards. The sound was a punctuation mark, a definitive end to her monumental effort. Eleanor stood upright, swaying slightly, her chest heaving. Her breath came in ragged, tearing gasps, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a shuddering release. Her vision was still a little blurred, the edges of the room swimming before her eyes. She felt a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull her to the ground. But beneath it, a strange, exhilarating rush coursed through her veins. She had done it. She had truly done it. She slowly turned, her eyes finding Silas. He stood exactly where she had left him, just inside the cabin entrance, his gaze fixed on her. The earlier frustration had completely vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of absolute, genuine shock. His eyes, usually so sharp and piercing, were wide, their depths revealing a profound disbelief. His jaw was slack, his lips slightly parted. The stern, dismissive facade he had worn for weeks, the careful mask of indifference and judgment, had utterly shattered. It was gone, replaced by a raw, naked astonishment. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. The thud of the trunk still seemed to reverberate. The only sounds were Eleanor's own ragged breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. Silas remained speechless, staring at Eleanor with an intensity she had never witnessed before. His gaze held a mixture of shock, yes, but beneath it, something else was dawning. There was a quiet, undeniable respect, a recognition of strength he had not believed possible. And deeper still, a hint of something unreadable, a nascent emotion in his piercing eyes that she could not decipher. A quiet change began to ripple through the small cabin, a shift so subtle Eleanor almost missed it at first. Silas's usual clipped tones, once edged with an almost imperceptible disdain, now seemed to carry a different weight. His instructions, though still sparse, lost the biting undertone that had gnawed at her before. He no longer barked orders from across the room, but sometimes she noticed he would stand closer, his voice a low rumble she could almost feel in her chest as he pointed out a knot in the wood or the proper way to set a snare. There was no softening of his gaze. Not exactly, but the piercing sharpness had dulled, replaced by something less like judgment and more like plain observation. She watched him, always from the corner of her eye, trying to discern the meaning behind each slight alteration in his manner, her guard still tightly drawn. Each morning she woke with a knot of anxiety, expecting the old Silas, the one who saw only her shortcomings, the one who measured her worth against an impossible standard. But each morning she found a different Silas, not gentle, not kind, but undeniably changed. It was like watching the mountain weather. The wind still blew, but the ice had begun to thaw, just enough to be noticed, just enough to offer a sliver of hope she hadn't dared to acknowledge. The first definite sign had come the very next morning as Eleanor stoked the embers in the hearth. Silas, rather than simply issuing a command about the day's work, had gestured towards the kindling pile. "Needs more dry pine," he had grunted. And then, a fraction of a second later, he had tossed a small, perfectly cut piece of resinous wood onto the heap. It was a simple act, but it was a shared act, a small offering of assistance rather than just an expectation. Eleanor's hands paused above the coals, her fingers tightening on the iron poker. A warmth, not from the fire, spread through her chest. It was a flicker of something she had starved for. Partnership. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the gesture directly, but the scent of burning pine filled the small space, and the silence between them was suddenly different, less oppressive, more companionable. Days blurred into a rhythm of shared labor under the vast, watchful sky. She learned to read the subtle changes in the mountain air, the way the wind whispered warnings through the pines, the sharp tang of coming snow. Silas began to offer less critical instructions, his words fewer, more direct, stripped of any hidden challenge. When she finally managed to split a particularly gnarled log with a single clean strike, he didn't praise her. He simply gave a curt nod, his eyes lingering on the cleaved wood for a moment longer than necessary. Eleanor felt a jolt, a physical recognition of effort, a quiet validation that made her shoulders straighten. It was not the effusive praise she might have once craved, but it was honest. It was real. This man, who judged only by capability, had seen her strength. He had seen it, and he had acknowledged it, not with words, but with that slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his chin. Her work became less a desperate struggle for survival and more a focused endeavor. The ache in her muscles was still present at the end of each day, a dull throb that sang of hard effort. But now it was accompanied by a different kind of satisfaction. She found herself anticipating the next task, not dreading it. She learned to haul water from the spring with a new efficiency, balancing the heavy buckets so the water barely sloshed. She learned to mend the rough-hewn fence lines with a careful eye for detail, making sure each repair would hold against the mountain's relentless elements. She still felt wary, every nerve alive to the possibility that this fragile truce might shatter, that Silas might revert to his initial dismissiveness. Her past had taught her to trust little, to expect less, but a small flicker of hope, stubborn and persistent, had begun to bloom within her. It was a recognition she hadn't dared to dream of, a quiet acknowledgement of her worth that resonated deep within her often wounded pride. One cold afternoon, while she was meticulously patching a hole in the cabin roof, a task Silas had assigned with a simple wave toward the damaged shingles, she felt his presence beside her. He didn't speak, didn't offer advice. Instead, he simply handed her a handful of fresh, dry nails, anticipating her need before she even had to reach for them. Her fingers brushed his, a brief, accidental contact that sent a strange warmth through her. She glanced up, surprised, and found his gaze fixed not on her, but on the repair itself, his expression thoughtful. There was no judgment, only concentration. It was a quiet moment, unremarkable to an outsider, but to Eleanor it felt momentous. He had trusted her with the repair. He had seen her work, and he had offered her not criticism, but silent assistance. Her heart beat a little faster, a tiny flutter against her ribs. They fell into a more harmonious rhythm of work, a silent partnership forming between them. The sounds of their labor mingled, the rhythmic thud of an axe, the scrape of a shovel, the creak of a bucket rope. Each movement seemed to anticipate the others. If Silas was hauling logs, Eleanor would instinctively begin clearing the path. If she was tending the small patch of stubborn mountain garden, he would appear with a freshly sharpened hoe. There were no conversations, no pleasantries, only the unspoken language of shared purpose. She realized she was learning to understand his unspoken cues, the slight tightening of his jaw that meant focus, the almost imperceptible tilt of his head that indicated good enough. And she saw, or perhaps imagined, that he was beginning to read hers too. Her slight hesitation before lifting a heavy stone, her careful inspection of a freshly planed board. They were like two solitary wolves now hunting in tandem, each aware of the other's position, each respecting the other's prowess. The cabin, once a place of tense silence and her private sorrow, began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a shared space. The scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, always present, now mingled with the earthy smell of freshly turned soil from Eleanor's small garden and the metallic tang of newly sharpened tools. She found herself humming softly while she worked, a quiet, almost unconscious melody that occasionally broke the cabin's usual stillness. Silas never commented, never interrupted her. He simply continued his task, his presence a steady, grounding force. Sometimes she would catch him observing her, not with the intrusive scrutiny of before, but with a quiet, contemplative air, as if he were trying to puzzle out a particularly complex riddle. One evening, as the last slivers of twilight painted the mountain peaks in shades of deep purple and orange, they were both outside, splitting firewood for the night's long burn. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine. Eleanor swung her axe with a growing confidence, the heavy head finding the grain of the wood with satisfying precision. Her arms, once slender, now had a defined strength, her shoulders broad from the constant labor. Silas worked opposite her, his movements economical and powerful, each stroke of his axe cleaving the wood with brutal efficiency. The rhythmic thudding filled the quiet evening, a steady beat against the encroaching darkness. As a particularly thick log yielded to her swing, Eleanor paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her gloved hand. Silas too paused, his axe resting against his thigh. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the mountain. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. His eyes, keen and piercing, met hers. He held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer than usual, a direct look that felt different, less critical, more observant. The air between them hummed with an unspoken tension, an acknowledgement of something new, something deeper than mere working partnership. The mountain changed with savage speed. One moment, crisp autumn air lingered. The next, a fierce wind tore through pines, whipping snow from unseen peaks. A low growl became a relentless howl, flattening chimney smoke against the rough-hewn roof. Within hours, the world outside was a blurred white wall of driving snow and biting cold. Silas swiftly secured windows with heavy planks. He banked the fire high, dry pines spitting sparks into the hearth. Eleanor watched him from her lean-to doorway. The rudimentary shelter succumbed to the blizzard's fury. Icy drafts pierced thin walls, the ground inside frosted over. She knew sleeping there meant frostbite, perhaps worse. Her heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm. A charging bear felt less daunting than this trapped vulnerability. Silas met her gaze across the dim space, his eyes sharp. He nodded towards the cabin, a silent, pragmatic command. Stepping inside, blessed warmth enveloped Eleanor, stark against the biting cold she left. The cabin, usually sparse, felt a fragile shell against the storm's raw power. Pine resin and wood smoke intensified, a comforting blanket. Silas had already laid a bedroll by the fire. This gesture spoke volumes. He was not one for pleasantries, but his actions carried quiet weight. The first day was a symphony of the storm's wrath. Wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling heavy planks over the windows. Snow piled against the door, muffling the outside world into an eerie quiet. Inside, their silence was different. No longer tense, it became a heavy, unspoken understanding of their shared predicament. Eleanor occupied the space more fully, her presence a fact. She moved with quiet grace, tending fire, preparing meager meals. Silas sharpened tools, mended a worn saddle strap, his movements deliberate. He did not stare with the old critical intensity, though his eyes still tracked her, always observing. She noticed small lines around his eyes when he concentrated, a slight tremor in his hand as he honed a blade. He was more than a gruff mountain man. He was human, vulnerable to elements and time. The air was thick with damp earth and metallic tang. The fire crackled, a living presence in the cabin's heart. As the second day wore on, forced proximity chipped away at the walls they had both built. There was no escape, nowhere to retreat. The storm roared its unending protest, demanding full attention. Yet inside, a different quiet settled. Eleanor watched the fire dance, its orange glow painting fleeting patterns on the rough log walls. Her gaze drifted to Silas, hunched over wood, carving with slow, precise strokes. His calloused, strong hands moved with unexpected delicacy. "You've seen worse storms than this, I suppose," Eleanor ventured, her voice a soft ripple in the unbroken silence. It was the first truly non-essential question she had asked him since her arrival. Silas paused his carving, eyes lifting to hers. The hawk-like intensity had softened, perhaps from firelight or something else. "Aye," he grunted, a small knot of wood curling from his blade. "Winter of '83, lost a good dog then, a hound named Buster. Thought he could outrun anything." A flicker of deep sadness crossed his face, gone quickly. He returned to his carving, the anecdote hanging, a wisp of his solitary past. Eleanor felt a surprising tenderness well up. He spoke of a Darwin, a personal loss that painted him not just as a survivor, but as someone who felt deeply. Her fingers tightened around the warm tea, its heat a comfort against the cold seeping through the walls. Every creature eventually met its match in the unforgiving mountains. "I had a bird once," she said, almost to herself, surprising herself. "A small finch. Found it with a broken wing. Tried to mend it." She paused, a memory of soft feathers and a tiny beating heart filling her mind. "It never flew again. Just hopped." She felt his gaze, not looking at him. "People said I was foolish. Said it was unnatural to keep such a thing." The last words, barely a whisper, held a deep, old ache. The cabin air thickened, charged with unspoken histories. Silas's carving knife lay still. He looked at her with unfamiliar, quiet intensity, not judgment. Her small confession seemed to unlock a shared understanding of holding on to fragility when the world said to let go. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, a fitting backdrop to the emotional storm brewing within them. She felt a strange mix of relief and vulnerability. Offering a past fragment to this gruff, solitary man was a risk she rarely allowed herself. But something in the cabin's shared intimacy, the forced quiet, the unexpected warmth of his earlier admission, compelled her. The fire cast long, dancing shadows, distorting familiar objects, making the cabin feel both vast and impossibly small. Silas picked up his carving again, movement slower, more contemplative. "Foolish to care for a creature," he murmured, rough-edged, almost a question. "There's no foolishness in that." His voice was low, devoid of its usual curtness. Eleanor felt a knot in her chest loosen, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. He understood not the specifics of her past, but the underlying sentiment. She looked at him then, truly looked. She saw a quiet strength, a steadfastness mirroring her own desperate need to endure. His piercing eyes held a flicker of empathy she had not seen before. The cold outside was a constant, pressing force, but inside a different kind of warmth was building. Slowly, tentatively. The hours melted into the storm's relentless rhythm. They ate in companionable silence, simple food tasting richer in the cozy confines of the cabin. Eleanor found herself observing Silas with new curiosity. How he held his fork, his beard catching the firelight, the quiet sigh he sometimes made when settling back against the rough wall. These were not the observations of a wary worker, but of someone beginning to see the man behind the role. She began to feel a pull, a subtle desire to understand more, to bridge the chasm of their solitary lives. He too seemed to linger on her, his gaze occasionally resting on her face for a moment longer. There was no demand, no judgment, only a quiet, searching observation. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, two independent spirits slowly, reluctantly, finding a shared space. The cabin air grew heavy with burning wood and damp wool. Eleanor shifted closer to the fire, stretching her fingers towards the flames. The warmth was a balm against the memory of the freezing outside world, and against the lingering chill of her own past. She wondered what else Silas might have lost, what else he carried from his long years of solitude. He was an enigma, carved from the very mountains around them, unyielding yet capable of unexpected tenderness. She imagined him tracking through deep snow, his loyal dog Buster at his heels, their bond a silent pact against the wilderness. It was a life of harsh choices, relentless struggle, and a fierce beauty to it, a stark honesty that resonated with her own spirit. She understood solitude's lure, the protection it offered from a world that often misunderstood and judged. Flickering firelight cast dancing shadows, stretching and shrinking on the walls, making the small cabin feel vast and alive. The storm outside seemed to intensify its efforts, its furious roar a constant presence. Yet within these four walls, a strange, profound quiet had settled. It was not an empty silence, but one brimming with the weight of two lives, two pasts, slowly beginning to intertwine. Eleanor felt her guard lower a fraction more, a sensation both terrifying and exhilarating. She had spent years building those walls, fortifying herself against the world's harsh gaze. Now, in this isolated cabin, with the storm raging, they seemed to crumble, brick by slow brick. Silas, too, seemed less rigid, less like a statue carved from stone. The shared experience of being trapped, relying on each other for warmth and company, forged a connection stronger than any task they had completed together. She found herself wishing the storm would last longer, if only to prolong these moments of fragile understanding. The fear of returning to the world, to judgment and struggle, began to recede, replaced by a nascent hope she hadn't realized she was capable of feeling. Her fingers, still wrapped around the now cool cup, felt a gentle tremor. It was not from the cold, but from the stirrings of something new, something profound. Silas finished his carving, setting the small, meticulously shaped piece of wood on the hearth to dry. He leaned back against the wall, his gaze once again settling on Eleanor. The comfortable silence stretched between them, no longer an awkward void, but a shared space of quiet contemplation. The storm outside raged with undiminished fury, its wild cries echoing the untamed spirit of the mountains. But inside, the air was still, warm and thick with an unspoken understanding. Then Silas spoke, his voice a low rumble, cutting through the storm's lament. "What made you leave it all behind?" Eleanor felt the question settle between them. Her heart thumped against her ribs. Firelight made Silas's eyes seem deeper, more earnest. Wood smoke clung to him. She swallowed, her throat dry. Words caught in her mind, a tangled knot of old hurts. She looked away, her gaze falling to the flickering flames. Memories of Oakhaven, the scrutinizing stares, felt fresh. "People," she began, her voice a low murmur above the fire's crackle. She searched for words. "People often see what they expect to see us." Silas's gaze remained steady, patient, an invitation. This quiet acceptance felt unfamiliar. "I was different," she confessed, a tremor in her voice. The admission felt raw. "Too tall," some said. "Too strong for a woman," others whispered. "My ideas never quite fit the mold." An ache of loneliness settled in her chest. Women would stiffen when she entered a room. Men sometimes mocked her stature. Eleanor could never shrink herself enough for their unspoken rules. Her mind raced with past images. Longing for connection was a constant hum. "I left," she finished, her eyes meeting his. "I left because I was tired of trying to be something I was not, for people who would never truly see me anyway." The words hung, weighted with struggle. Her breath hitched. Tears pricked her eyes, a surprising wave of emotion. It felt like a profound release. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. A flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The fire's warmth seemed to deepen their shared space. She felt a warmth spread through her, a rare gift of being heard. The storm outside had subsided, leaving an unnatural calm. The wind stopped, replaced by melting snowdrips. A profound quiet settled between them, a new intimacy. Eleanor felt a tremor, a sense of connection. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. The next morning, the world was cloaked in white. Fresh snow covered everything, muffling sounds. The air was intensely cold. Eleanor shivered, her breath fogging. The silence was unnerving, broken only by their boots' crunch on the frozen snow. Silas, his face grim, pointed to a disturbance near the sheep pen. The snow was churned up, a dark stain marking torn ground. Distinct tracks, larger than any body, led into the dense pines. Wolves, he stated, his voice flat. One of their sheep was gone. Her stomach clenched. This felt like an assault on their fragile hold. Silas moved with focused intensity, his eyes scanning the trees. The air carried a faint predatory scent. The winter's too hard, Silas continued, his gaze fixed on the tracks. They're desperate. He spoke of a stark fact. Eleanor watched him, worry tightening her chest. She had seen him stern, but this was different. This threat reached their core. She felt primal fear, recognizing the brutal calculus of survival. Their conversation was clipped, efficient. It was all about action, about survival. Silas explained their plan. Track the pack, set snares, patrol relentlessly. No room for hesitation. The snow would hide their prey, but also reveal their paths. The hunt had begun, and they were both hunter and hunted. They spent the morning tracking. Eleanor found her long legs an advantage, keeping pace with Silas. The cold bit at her exposed skin, numbing her cheeks and nose. The world was white, dotted with pine and rock. The forest silence was profound, broken only by their boots' crunch and a raven's distant caw. Silas moved with a predator's grace, his eyes missing nothing. He taught her to read subtle signs in the snow, a twig, a scent, the prints. Eleanor absorbed every lesson, her mind sharp, her focus absolute. She felt a strange purpose, a clarity rare in her former life. Here, the rules were simple, brutal, undeniable. They found several places where the pack had rested, depressions in the snow, a few dropped hairs. The smell was stronger, musky and feral. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was a formidable adversary, cunning and driven by hunger. She felt respect for Silas, for his deep understanding of this land. Her past felt hazy. By afternoon, their fingers were numb despite thick gloves. They stopped at a small clearing, sheltered by firs, to set their first snares. Silas produced a sturdy coil of wire. He knelt, his movements precise. Eleanor watched, then mimicked him, her hands clumsy compared to his. Like this, he muttered, his breath clouding. He showed her how to bend the wire into a noose, anchor it, camouflage it. His rough hand brushed hers as he guided her, a brief electric contact. She quickly pulled her hand away, feigning focus, but her heart fluttered. The cold made her fingers ache, but this fleeting touch seemed to thaw something deep inside her. They worked in silence, only clothes rustling, a twig snapping, a hawk crying. Eleanor felt new sensations, the metallic tang of the wire, the biting cold, the scent of pine and damp earth. Beneath it all, a sense of partnership grew. She felt sharper, attuned to the wild, her senses heightened. As dusk painted the sky, they returned to the cabin, exhausted. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows, making the space feel comforting and vulnerable. Eleanor's muscles ached from the long day. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it, her mind replaying the wolf tracks, the snare wire. The next few days blurred into vigilance and labor. They patrolled Silas's land from dawn to dusk, scanning, straining for sounds. The cold persisted. More tracks appeared, closer to the cabin, bolder. The wolves were growing desperate, and their desperation made them dangerous. Eleanor learned to move through the forest with agility, her clumsiness replaced by competence. She found a rhythm in the work, her long limbs invaluable for traversing drifts, her body hardened, becoming resilient. Her hands, already capable, showed deeper grooves of constant work. One evening, after another fruitless patrol, Silas slammed his fist onto the table, a rare display of anger. "They're circling," he growled, his jaw tight. "They're smart. Too smart." He rarely showed such emotion, and Eleanor felt a pang of concern. Tension in the cabin pressed in on them. The threat wore at their nerves. She watched him, her heart heavy. The threat to their flock was a threat to everything. Without the sheep, their winter stores would dwindle. Without Silas, she knew she would not survive alone. A new fear, cold and sharp, pierced her. It was not just for her own survival, but for his. She realized how much she relied on him for companionship and purpose. The thought of losing him sent a shiver through her. "We'll catch them," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, a steady counterpoint to his frustration. She reached across the table, then gently placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were taut. She felt his skin's heat. Her touch, meant as comfort, felt like a powerful connection. Silas looked at her, his eyes, usually sharp, now held a deep weariness. As his gaze met hers, a spark of resolve appeared. He did not pull away. The gesture was a testament to their bond. In that moment, surrounded by the mountain silence and the looming threat, they were truly a unit. The next night, the air was clear, the moon a brilliant orb casting stark shadows. The cold was brutal, seeping into their bones. They decided on a more aggressive patrol, hoping to intercept the pack. Eleanor's senses were on high alert, every sound a jolt of adrenaline. The metallic taste of fear was present. They moved silently through the pines, their breath pluming white. The only sound was their boots' crunch and Eleanor's heart thumping. Silas walked ahead, his rifle ready. Eleanor followed, her hunting knife clutched in her hand. Suddenly, Silas froze. He held up a hand, a silent signal. Eleanor stopped instantly, her heart leaping. She strained her ears, hearing only her blood. Then a low, guttural growl, followed by snarls, carried on the crisp air. It came from ahead, just beyond the thicket. The strong, wild scent hit her nostrils. They were close, too close. Eleanor felt a jolt of primal fear, cold and electrifying. Her fingers locked around her knife hilt, knuckles white. She looked at Silas, his profile stark against the moonlight, his jaw set. He nodded, indicating a flanking maneuver. They would approach from two sides, her breath hitched. This was about facing a dangerous force. She veered left, moving with cautious tread, her eyes fixed on the shadows. The growls intensified, chilling her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw them. Three shadowy forms, eyes glinting, circling Silas. They were bigger than she had imagined, their coats thick and shaggy. One, a massive alpha, lunged, a dark blur. "Silas!" Eleanor cried out, a raw sound. Her mind screamed, instinct to protect him overriding fear. Without a second thought, she broke cover, running towards the charging wolf, a desperate, reckless move. She aimed for its flank, hoping to distract it. Her long legs propelled her forward with unexpected speed. The wolf, startled, hesitated, its head snapping towards her. This brief pause gave Silas the opening. His rifle roared, shattering the silence. The alpha wolf yelped, stumbled, its charge broken. It turned, snarling, its eyes fixed on Silas. Before it could regroup, another wolf, larger than the others, broke from the shadows, eyes gleaming. It lunged at Eleanor, seeing her as easier prey. Eleanor saw it coming, a terrifying blur of fur and snapping teeth. She barely had time to brace herself. The impact was jarring, throwing her backward into a snowdrift. The wolf was on her, its weight heavy, its breath hot and foul. A scream caught in her throat. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the wolf was too strong. Its teeth grazed her arm, a searing pain. Then, a sudden violent blur. Silas, moving with astonishing speed, was there. He brought the butt of his rifle down with a sickening thud, connecting with the wolf's head. The creature yelped, a high-pitched cry, and rolled off Eleanor, momentarily stunned. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle again. The wolf scrambled to its feet, shaking its head, disoriented. The other two wolves, intimidated, began to back away. their snarls turning to whines. Silas aimed his rifle at the struggling wolf on the ground. Another shot echoed through the trees, a clean, sharp sound. The wolf shuddered, then collapsed, its struggles ceasing. The remaining two wolves, their leader wounded and another fallen, lost their aggression. They turned, melting back into the shadows of the forest. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Eleanor's ragged breathing and her pounding heart. The metallic taste in her mouth was overwhelming. Eleanor pushed herself up, trembling, a dull ache in her arm. She looked at Silas. He stood over the fallen wolf, his rifle still smoking, his chest heaving. His face, usually composed, was etched with fierce intensity. His eyes, when they met hers, were wind dark, filled with profound emotion. He dropped to his knees beside her, his rough hands immediately reaching for her arm, gently pushing up her sleeve. The tear in her coat was superficial, the skin underneath barely broken, but he still examined it with painstaking care, his fingers surprisingly gentle. Eleanor watched him, mesmerized by his intense focus, by the unexpected tenderness in his touch. She felt tears sting her eyes, not from pain, but from adrenaline and fierce gratitude. "Are you all right?" Silas's voice was a rough whisper, filled with a concern, his gaze fixed on her, searching her face. His body was still trembling, with the aftershocks of the fight, a mirror to her own. The air hummed with echoes of danger. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with emotion. Her breath plumed white in the frigid air, mingling with his. She looked at his face, so close to hers, illuminated by the cold moonlight. His eyes held a depth she had never seen, a raw vulnerability that cracked through his usual stoicism. In that moment, stripped bare by fear and shared danger, there were no roles, just two people, hearts thundering. They stood there, close in the vast cold night, raw from shared danger, their breaths mingling. The frigid air still bit at Eleanor's lungs as she and Silas made their way back to the cabin. The metallic tang of fear clung to her tongue, a stark counterpoint to the lingering warmth from Silas's side. They had fought side by side, their movements synchronized by instinct, their lives intertwined in that brutal moment. The raw adrenaline still hummed beneath her skin, making her senses sharper, more alive than usual. Every rustle of dry leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the vast silence of the mountain night. Silas walked a few paces ahead, his rifle still clutched firmly in one hand, his posture rigid. Yet something in his gait seemed different, less solitary, as if a thread now connected them even in the darkness. Eleanor could feel his presence as a solid, comforting weight beside her, a stark contrast to the hollow ache she had carried for so long. She focused on the steady rhythm of his boots crunching on the frozen earth, letting the sound anchor her in the present. The moonlight, silver and sharp, cast long, dancing shadows of pines around them, making the familiar path seem both alien and profoundly intimate. Inside the cabin, the embers in the hearth still pulsed with a deep orange glow. Silas immediately stoked the fire, adding fresh logs, and soon the small space was filled with the dancing light and the comforting crackle of burning wood. Eleanor watched him, the strong lines of his back, the way his shoulders moved under the worn fabric of his shirt. Her fingers still tingled from the recoil of her own rifle, but her entire being felt suffused with a different kind of tremor now. It was a tremor of something profound, something both frightening and intensely desirable. She sat on the edge of her makeshift cot, pulling off her boots, the leather stiff and cold against her numb fingers. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, mingled now with the faint, wild smell of the animals they had faced. Silas turned from the fire, his gaze falling upon her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. His eyes, usually so sharp and unyielding, held a softness she had never seen before, a lingering concern that warmed her from the inside out. Eleanor felt a blush creep up her neck, her heart thrumming against her ribs. She looked away, pretending to fuss with her bootlaces, but her mind reeled. The intensity of their shared experience had stripped away all pretenses, all their carefully constructed walls. In the face of pure, primal danger, they had been simply two human beings, relying on each other for survival. That raw truth now lay bare between them, vibrating in the quiet air of the cabin. Silas sat opposite her on his own stool by the hearth, resting his rifle against the wall. He picked up a small piece of kindling, turning it over and over in his calloused fingers, his movements slow and deliberate. The firelight played across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by weather and solitude, but also softening the edges of his usually stern expression. Eleanor stole another glance at him, her gaze drawn to the quiet strength in his hands. A sudden sharp draft snaked through a chink in the logs, raising goosebumps on her arms. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Silas looked up at the sound, his eyes meeting hers again. This time the gaze held, long and searching, filled with an unspoken question. Eleanor found herself unable to break away, caught in the silent current that flowed between them. It was a moment suspended outside of time, where only their breathing and the crackle of the fire seemed real. Her mind raced, a tumultuous swirl of emotions she dared not name. Fear because this feeling was new and overwhelming, threatening to dismantle the careful defenses she had built over years of rejection. Longing, a deep, aching desire for connection she had buried so deeply she had almost forgotten its existence. And a terrifying hope, a fragile, nascent belief that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a place where she belonged, with a man who saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. The silence stretched, not awkward but profound. It was a silence filled with the weight of unspoken words, with memories of shared danger, and with the burgeoning awareness of something utterly new. Eleanor watched the fire dance, the flames reflecting in Silas's eyes, making them seem even deeper, like pools of warm amber. She felt a strange pull, a gravitational force drawing her towards him, despite every instinct telling her to retreat, to protect her bruised heart. Her past whispered to her then, the echoes of cruel laughter, the dismissive glances, the constant judgment of her height and her independence. How could a man like Silas, rugged and self-sufficient, ever truly look at her, Eleanor Vance, the tall, outcast woman, with anything more than a grudging respect? Yet the way he was looking at her now, the softness in his gaze, seemed to defy all those painful memories. It was a warmth that promised something more, something she hardly dared to dream of. Silas shifted slightly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but it drew her attention back to him completely. He cleared his throat, a low, rumbling sound, but no words followed. He just continued to watch her, his expression a complex mixture of concern, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite decipher. It was an intensity that spoke volumes, cutting through her fears and doubts with a quiet power. Eleanor's fingers locked around the rough wooden edge of the cot, her knuckles white. She felt as though if she let go, she might unravel completely. Her body felt both heavy and light at the same time, her breath shallow in her chest. She wanted to speak, to break the potent silence, but no words came. Her throat felt tight, constricted by the sheer force of the emotions swelling within her. This was more terrifying, in a way, than facing the wolves. This was a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to feel. He reached out slowly, his hand moving towards her, then pausing halfway. It was a gesture filled with hesitation, a rare display of uncertainty from the usually resolute man. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, her gaze fixed on his approaching hand. It was a strong hand, scarred and weathered, a working hand that had built this cabin and carved a life out of the wilderness. It was the hand that had held her steady during the wolf attack, the hand that had fought alongside hers. Her entire being yearned for that touch, a confirmation, a physical manifestation of the unspoken connection that now vibrated between them. Every fiber of her being screamed for him to close the distance, to bridge the small gap that separated them. A tremor ran through her, a rush of blood buoyed to her head, making her feel lightheaded. This was it, she thought. This was the moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet cabin. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, Silas's hand stopped. It hovered in the air for a breathless moment, suspended between them, a silent testament to the raw, fragile emotions that hung heavy in the air. His gaze flickered to her face, then down to his own hand, then back to hers. The warmth in his eyes remained, but it was now tinged with a flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps restraint. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he retracted his hand. It was a quiet movement, yet it resonated like a thunderclap in the charged atmosphere. He drew it back, placing it on his knee, his fingers curling into a loose fist. The sudden withdrawal left Eleanor feeling as if a vital piece of the air had been snatched away, leaving her gasping for breath. The unspoken desires, the terrifying hopes, and the profound uncertainty now hung thick and heavy in the space between them. The small, crinkled envelope felt like a stone in Eleanor's palm. Its edges were stiff, the paper pale against her brown fingers. Old Thomas, the trapper, dropped it on the cabin stoop, his greeting lost to the wind. He hurried back down the trail, leaving a quiet that stirred old unease, a world she had almost forgotten. The elegant script was not for her. It read, Miss E. Vance, Seco General Store, Oakhaven. Ma O'Malley must have forwarded it, remembering the name from an old advertisement. Eleanor's breath hitched, a knot tightening in her chest. She had believed herself forgotten, a ghost from a past life. Now, a fragile piece of that past found her door, miles across the wilderness. She carried the letter inside, its weight pressing against her ribs. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of warmth, suddenly felt too small. Silas chopped wood outside, his axe a steady rhythm against her frantic heart. She sat at the table, the letter a challenge before her. Her fingers trembled as she tore open the seal, the crisp rip echoing in her mind. Words blurred at first. It was from Sarah Jenkins, a distant aunt Eleanor barely recalled. Sarah wrote of a small inheritance from a great uncle Eleanor never met. More than money, the letter offered concern, an invitation back east. It spoke of comfort, of safety, of being among her own kind. Among her own kind. The phrase struck her. It was a kind sentiment, yet it carried the sting of memory, the whisper of reasons she fled. Her difference, her height, her refusal to fit a town's delicate expectations. She recalled sidelong glances, hushed conversations, thinly veiled pity. She was too much, too bold for polite society. Eleanor came to Oakhaven for anonymity, a place where her body was a tool, not a spectacle. Here, with Silas in this wild corner, she had found it. Nausea washed over her, chilling her despite the fire. The ink lines brought back a suffocating feeling of being trapped, judged, forced to shrink. She closed her eyes, memories flooding her. Market whispers, averted gazes, the ache of constant loneliness. She was always an outsider looking in, her eyes open to cabin walls pressing in. The wood smoke, usually comforting, now felt heavy. The silence, once a balm, amplified a frantic drumming in her ears. She could return to that life, to safety, even acceptance, by becoming someone else. But the thought tasted like ash. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the mountain landscape under a sky heavy with snow. This place demanded everything but did not judge. It simply existed. Raw. Here, her strength was a necessity, her height an advantage. With Silas, she was not Eleanor Vance, the outcast. She was simply Eleanor, capable, needed. She thought of their long days working in a rhythm that needed no words. Silas would hand her a tool, knowing she knew. Shared meals by the fire, a comfortable silence replacing tension. The fear faced together against wolves, their bodies moving as one. The lingering touch, the intense gaze, unspoken desires filling the air nights ago. A warmth spread through her, a counterpoint to the cold dread. It was a fragile warmth, born of shared hardship and quiet understanding, unlike any she had known. This was belonging, a feeling she had yearned for, blooming in this remote cabin with this solitary man. But fear still coiled in her belly. What if this was temporary? What if Silas too would find her too much, too different? What if their quiet affection was just a mirage? She had known rejection too many times, her hopes dashed. To hope again, to risk her heart here, felt terrifying. Old wounds throbbed, raw. Silas entered, bringing pine scent and mountain chill. He stomped snow from his boots, efficient and quiet. He said nothing, but his sharp eyes landed on the letter in her hand. He saw her trembling fingers, her pale face, the troubled look in her eyes. He saw her shrink, retreating from the confidence she had slowly found. He set his axe down, a soft thud. He walked to the fire, stoking it with a practiced hand, sending sparks up the chimney. Flames licked higher, casting shadows, illuminating the heavy tension. Eleanor watched, her breath held. His jaw was set, his brow furrowed, his shoulders seemed to carry the mountain's weight. He was solid, real, unlike her past fleeting promises. He turned, his gaze meeting hers. His usually guarded eyes held a flicker of concern, of understanding. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting her thoughts weigh. The fire crackled, the wind howled, her heart beat frantically. These were the only sounds. "Trouble there?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through her turmoil. It was a simple, open question, unlike the judgment she knew. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to lie, to dismiss it, but she could not with him. She unfolded the letter, tracing the elegant script. "It's from a relative," she whispered. "From back east. They want me to return." Silas listened, his expression unreadable. He did not move, did not interrupt. His piercing eyes took in her distress. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet safe under his unwavering gaze. She was unaccustomed to such quiet, patient attention, to someone truly seeing her turmoil. "They talk of a small inheritance," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "In a place, a life, a proper life." The word proper tasted like ash. She knew what that proper life meant. Stifling expectations, perpetual loneliness. She looked up, her eyes pleading. "They don't know what it was like, to be always too much, always out of place." Her voice broke. A hot tear escaped, tracing her cheek. It was a tear of old pain, of deep loneliness, of fear that her old life might return. Silas stepped closer until he stood before her. He did not touch her, yet his presence was an anchoring warmth. He took the letter from her trembling hands, his rough fingers brushing hers. He scanned the lines, brow furrowed, lips pressed thin. He read slowly, absorbing the polite words, the hidden expectations. He handed the letter back, his gaze steady. "A proper life," he repeated, his voice holding understanding, not judgment. His eyes swept over her tall frame, strong hands, stubborn jaw. He saw the woman who had shifted the trunk, faced down wolves, made a place in his desolate world. "This," he said, quiet but firm, "is a life." He gestured around the cabin, toward the demanding world outside. "Mom, your life, you built it." Eleanor's heart gave a fierce lurch. His few simple words carried unexpected weight. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact, a recognition of her struggles. He saw her not as an outcast, but as a builder, a partner. A fresh wave of emotion washed over her. Relief, gratitude, a soaring hope. The neat script of the letter now seemed fragile, irrelevant. That life offered safety, perhaps, but it was small, confining. A return to shadows. The life she found here with Silas was hard, dangerous, yet real, expansive, filled with the raw beauty of struggle. She thought of comfort in his silent presence. The trust grown between them, brick by careful brick. His warm gaze, unspoken promises in his lingering touch. She pictured a future here with him, facing the mountain's harsh realities, building something new, truly her own. The thought sent a thrill, a mix of fear and exhilarating promise. The choice was about two versions of herself, the one who fled, burdened by the past, and the one forged by wilderness. Stronger, more resilient, daring to hope. Fear of old judgments still gnawed, a persistent ache. But a larger force overshadowed it, the desire to stay, to fight for this fragile belonging. She looked at Silas, his eyes fixed on her, waiting. He did not press, did not manipulate. He offered his truth, his quiet presence. She saw in his gaze not just respect, but something deeper, mirroring her own burgeoning feelings. It was a silent invitation, a steady hand across the chasm of her past. Her fingers tightened around the letter. Then, with a decisive motion, she tore it in half. The sound was sharp, definitive, closing a chapter forever. She tore it again and again until the elegant script was meaningless scraps scattering to the floor. It was a physical release, a shedding of old skin. A profound peace settled over her, quiet and deep. The knot in her chest unraveled, her breath came easier. The cabin no longer felt small, it felt like home. Pine and wood smoke, no longer suffocating, became the smell of her life, her future. She felt a lightness unknown in years, a freedom from others' expectations. She looked into Silas's eyes. For the first time, she saw her own hope reflected there, clear and strong. The unspoken desires, lingering since the wolf attack, now felt tangible, real. She felt the warmth of her tears, not sorrow, but profound relief and fierce determination. Eleanor, her eyes shining with unshed tears and newfound resolve, turned to Silas. With a voice full of conviction, she declared, "My place is here, with you." Eleanor's words hung in the air, a fragile bridge built over years of silence and unspoken yearning. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat demanding an answer, demanding a future. The cabin, usually so filled with the crackle of fire or the rustle of their movements, now held its breath, waiting. She watched Silas, every muscle in her body tensed, anticipating a reaction, bracing for anything. His face, usually a mask of stoic reserve, softened around the edges, the lines etched by sun and wind smoothing out with a quiet tenderness she had rarely seen. His eyes, those keen, hawk-like eyes, met hers, and in their depth, Eleanor saw not just understanding, but a profound, overwhelming relief. He took a slow step towards her, then another, closing the small distance that had always separated them. His calloused hand, the one that had shown her how to fell timber and track game, reached out, not hovering this time, but moving with a certainty that stole her breath. He cupped her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away the single tear that had finally escaped her eye. The warmth of his skin against hers was an electric current, sending shivers through her. It was a touch that spoke volumes, a silent promise woven into the rough texture of his palm. "My place is here too," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, barely above a whisper. It was deeper than she remembered, laced with an emotion that made her own throat tighten. "Always has been, I suppose." He paused, his gaze searching hers, as if looking for any lingering doubt, any shred of the past that might pull her away. Eleanor shook her head, a silent reassurance. The past, with its judgments and rejections, felt a million miles away, a faint echo against the roaring current of this present moment. She had found her anchor, her safe harbor, in this man who had once seen her only as a capable hand. Her own hand rose, finding his, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. The unspoken words, the fears, the hopes, the deep, tender affection that had grown between them like a hardy mountain flower, now bloomed in the space between them. She had spent a lifetime feeling too tall, too strong, too much for the world. But with Silas, she felt exactly right. He saw her strength, not as a challenge, but as a complement to his own. He saw her heart, raw and vulnerable, and he offered his in return, a silent, unwavering pledge. "I tried to push you away," Silas confessed, his gaze dropping for a moment to their joined hands, then back to her eyes. "I didn't think I needed anyone. Didn't think anyone could fit here." His gesture encompassed the cabin, the mountains, his solitary life. "You proved me wrong, Eleanor. Every single day you proved me wrong." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a rare sight that made Eleanor's own heart leap. It was a smile of admission, of surrender, of pure, unadulterated affection. Eleanor felt a wave of tenderness wash over her, an aching sweetness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. She understood his resistance, his need for solitude. It mirrored her own, forged in the fires of past hurts and societal scorn. But they had broken through, not by force, but by quiet perseverance, by shared struggle, by the undeniable truth of who they were when together. Their journey had been fraught with misunderstanding, with silent battles of will, but it had culminated in this raw, honest moment, a recognition of a bond forged in the unforgiving crucible of the mountains. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief instant, savoring the feeling of belonging, of being truly seen. The scent of pine and wood smoke, so familiar now, mingled with the faint, clean scent of Silas himself, a smell that spoke of the wind, of home. of him. When she opened her eyes again, his were still fixed on hers, unwavering, full of a quiet intensity that mirrored her own burgeoning love. "I wouldn't let you," Eleanor whispered, her voice husky with emotion. "I couldn't. This place, it's become my home. You've become my reason." The words, once so impossible to imagine speaking, flowed from her, unburdened and true. She felt a lightness she hadn't known in years, a profound sense of peace settling deep within her chest. The fear of being outcast, of being alone, finally began to recede, replaced by a warmth that spread through her veins. Silas's hand moved from her cheek, sliding to the back of her neck, gently pulling her closer. His eyes held hers, a silent question, a deep yearning. Eleanor met his gaze, her breath catching in her throat, and then she leaned in, her lips meeting his in a tender, hesitant kiss. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, not yet, but one of profound tenderness, of shared understanding, of a quiet, powerful promise. His lips were rough, tasting of the mountain air, and something uniquely Silas. It was a kiss that spoke of patience, of endurance, of a love that had grown from the hardest ground. Her fingers locked around his shirt, clutching the rough fabric as if to ground herself in this moment, this reality. The years of rejection, the loneliness, the gnawing ache of being different, all seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his embrace. She felt his arms wrap around her waist, pulling her flush against his sturdy frame. His chest was solid beneath her cheek, his heartbeat a steady, comforting rhythm against her ear. It was the sound of safety, of belonging, of a future unfolding. They stood like that for a long time, simply holding each other, letting the silence speak of all the things they had left unsaid. The cabin was quiet around them, the fire crackling softly, the only witness to their shared revelation. Eleanor felt a deep, resonant peace settle over her, a quiet understanding that this was where she was meant to be. This mountain, this cabin, this man, they were her truth. She had found not just a place to survive, but a place to live, to truly thrive, to be loved for exactly who she was. When they finally pulled apart, it was with a reluctance that spoke of their newfound connection. Silas's thumb gently traced the curve of her jaw, his gaze still tender, still full of that quiet wonder. "We have a lot to talk about, Eleanor Vance," he murmured, a hint of his familiar gruffness returning, but now it was softened, infused with an entirely new meaning. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "I think we do, Silas Blackwood." They settled by the fire, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a comfortable, shared space. The air hummed with possibility, with the quiet thrill of a future waiting to be built. Silas, with a rare, relaxed posture, began to speak, not of daily chores, but of dreams. He spoke of adding a second room to the cabin, a proper sleeping space that was not a rough lean-to, but a place for them both. He spoke of expanding the small garden plot, envisioning rows of sturdy vegetables, their bounty feeding more than just one solitary man. Eleanor listened, her imagination taking flight. She pictured a larger window, letting in more of the mountain light, a small table where they could share meals, not just eat them. She thought of herbs drying from the rafters, the scent of warmth and home permeating air every corner. "We could clear that patch by the stream," she suggested, her voice eager. "Plant some fruit trees, apples, maybe." Silas nodded, his eyes bright with a shared vision. "Good idea, it gets enough sun there, and a proper root cellar for winter." He took a piece of charcoal from the fire and began to sketch rough lines on a scrap of parchment, outlining the cabin's new dimensions. Eleanor watched him, mesmerized, a thrill running through her at the sight of his strong hands planning their shared future. It was a partnership, truly, a melding of their practical skills and their burgeoning hopes. They talked about the traps, the hunting routes, the best times to trade their furs and dried meat in Oakhaven. Silas even spoke of a small, sturdy barn for a few head of cattle, a long-term goal that spoke of true permanence. Eleanor, who had always felt the burden of her own independence, now felt a liberating sense of collaboration. Her strength, her resilience, her keen eye for detail. They were not just for her own survival, but for theirs. The cabin, once a stark monument to Silas's self-imposed isolation, began to shed its austere skin even in their minds. It was no longer just a shelter against the elements. It was becoming a home, a sanctuary built on mutual respect and a quiet, steadfast love. The air, which had often felt heavy with unexpressed emotions, now felt light, vibrant with the hum of shared purpose. Eleanor imagined the scent of freshly sawn timber, the sounds of hammering and laughter, the warmth of a hearth that welcomed two souls, not just one. She looked around the room, seeing it anew. The rough-hewn walls seemed softer, the flickering firelight more inviting. Even the sturdy, iron-bound trunk, the very object that had shattered Silas's prejudice, now sat in a corner, a testament to her strength, but also to the turning point in their lives. It held not just possessions, but the memory of a pivotal moment, a silent reminder of how far they had come. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Silas led her outside. They stood at the cabin's edge, chateau, where the clearing met the dense forest, the vast, wild landscape stretching before them. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The mountains, once a symbol of insurmountable challenge, now seemed to embrace them, their towering peaks a silent promise of enduring strength. Eleanor looked out at the familiar vista, but it felt entirely different now. The rugged terrain, the untamed wilderness. It was no longer something to merely survive, but a canvas for their shared life. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in spectacular hues of orange, purple, and fiery red. The distant peaks, sharp and majestic, seemed to glow from within. Silas wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her gently against his side. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, finding its familiar solidity a comforting anchor. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing, a silent testament to the deep, enduring connection they had forged. The years of hardship, the initial dismissal, the quiet battles of will, the shared dangers, all had led them to this moment. They stood together, two resilient souls, now one ready to face whatever adventures the mountains and life itself might throw their way. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.